Hello and welcome to Cyberside Chats. My name is Sherri Davidoff. I'm the founder of LMG Security, and I'm very excited to have Bridget Quinn Choi here. Welcome, Bridget.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Today we're going to talk about the Stryker cyber attack that's been in the news. But first, tell us for a moment about your background and expertise.
So I'm a lawyer by trade. I used to practice here in New York City. And then I pivoted over to cyber claims. I did that for about 6 years. After working at insurance companies, I moved over to the consulting side. So I worked at general counsel at Kibu Consulting, which is digital forensics incident response firm. And then after that, I was director of incident response at Booz Allen Hamilton. And right now I pivoted back, a similar consulting role, but back to insurance. I'm at Woodruff Sawyer, which is a Gallagher company, and I do work with clients through tricky cyber privacy, tech, type issues, and I get them a policy that works for them.
That's great. So you're dealing with the bleeding edge technology, AI related policies, and you see things when they go sideways too, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Well, let's dig into the Stryker cyber attacks. Again, this has been in the news. They are a $25 billion medical device technology company, and they are down. My understanding is that they have 200,000 devices that have been, well, reportedly wiped. We're not quite sure what that means, but devices that are no longer functional. And that means that this is affecting their manufacturing capabilities, the supply chain. It's impacting suppliers. It's impacting the hospitals and the whole healthcare industry that relies on that. What is your perspective on this from a risk management standpoint? And also, were they insured? Is this something the cyber insurance industry is paying attention to?
So purportedly, based on their website, they did not have a cyber insurance policy, which is a trend that we're seeing sometimes with larger incidents. We saw it with the Jaguar attack. We saw it with Marks and Spencer. But by and large, these companies want to take the risk on their balance sheet. And one of the detriments to taking the risk on the balance sheet is not just that you will have to pay for an attack, hook, line, and sinker, including your downtime and lost revenue, but you don't have a set of you don't have the support, and you don't have third parties looking at what you think is good and saying, well, you're making this attestation that your environment is good. However, you, for example, have a very centralized control of identity management. You don't have microsegmentation. You don't have just-in-time access controls. So that's one of the detriments that these large companies are taking on their books, that they're not having that outside look from a market that sees, by and large, all the major attacks that occur.
So that's interesting. You're saying the insurance company also functions in a sense as oversight, sanity checking your understanding of your own risk and comparing you with other similar organizations. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Let's talk about a company that, for example, let's take a very simple control. You would think identity and access management is a simple control, but let's go even simpler, multi-factor authentication. If any company, big, small, or medium, tries to get cyber insurance without this key control in place, you won't be insurable. The insurance carriers will say, sorry, we pass on this risk. We do not want to insure you. We do not think you're a good risk. Some brokers may do something called pre-underwriting. So they would go to a company who didn't have this MFA enabled and say, listen, we're not going to be able to get you coverage right now with the controls you have in place. You should do 1, 2, and 3 to shore up your controls, and then we'll take you to the market. So
Right.
with a larger company, however, what you're doing is testing the risk, and you're going to get asked a lot of questions from underwriters who see the failures and controls day in and day out. So it's one way that the insurance industry, it motivates companies to continually improve their posture.
I have to say, I think the insurance industry has done more than probably any other industry in moving cybersecurity forward, in incentivizing cybersecurity controls. Because, it's not like there's laws in place that proactively say we have to have X controls and companies are getting audited on a regular basis. In most industries, that is not happening proactively. But it seems like that's happening when cyber insurance is creating that pressure or that incentive. And then also nowadays we see more customer vetting as well. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And, back to the Stryker attacks. One of the ways we believe this happened, according to news reports, is that the attackers got in and they actually used the organization's administrative tools against them. So they accessed an account that had administrative privileges through Microsoft Entra. From there, they were reportedly able to get into Intune, the mobile device management system, and then use that to push out commands and wipe devices. And it's not clear from reports whether these devices were fully wiped. But the bottom line is it was a stolen admin account and access to these administrative tools. And so we saw CISA and Microsoft both coming out with recommendations. And one that caught my attention was multi-factor authentication. They weren't just saying, come out with multi-factor authentication. They were saying use phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. And so I want to get your input on this because I see insurers checking on multi-factor authentication. I have not yet seen insurers asking, what kind of multi-factor authentication? Is it phishing resistant? Is that in our future? Is that going to come down the pipeline from insurers?
Oh, absolutely. I will tell you that is one of the controls that underwriters, they truly understand it. They understand how important it is. The gravity and the effectiveness. A number of years ago, Microsoft came out with a study, and it said something along the lines of, if you have MFA effectively used within your organization, it will prevent 98% of attacks. And
Right.
it does prove out that it is one of, in a layered defense, one of the very strong layers to thwart these sort of attacks. And I will say, as far as phishing resistant, we're seeing it more and more, particularly in larger environments where they can afford a different or a more sophisticated methodology for MFA.
Yeah, and just for our audience, to explain what phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication is, well, let's explain what it isn't. Attackers have gotten very good at bypassing multi-factor authentication because if you have a code that pops up in an app or it gets texted to your phone, they can trick people into typing that code into a phishing website. So you type in your username, you type in your password, you type in your multi-factor authentication code, they use it and they're in. And then maybe they steal your cookies or your token, and they have ongoing access to your account. So that has been happening on a regular basis. Criminals are very, very good at it. There's other ways that they bypass multi-factor authentication as well. But the bottom line is if you can trick a human into giving you information, it can undermine the whole authentication process. And so now we're seeing phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication that relies on things like passkeys, which are cryptographically authenticating your device. We're seeing biometrics, where it's hard to fake a fingerprint or facial recognition and things like that. So it's just harder for attackers to gain access to those things. So as someone who works at an insurance company, are you concerned about the centralized reliance on certain software or platforms? Because it seems like that cuts both ways. On the one hand, Microsoft has this very mature and sophisticated technology that allows you to push out software updates or make configuration changes on hundreds of thousands of devices at once. So that can be a real benefit to cybersecurity. And that's some very advanced and expensive technology that they've deployed. On the other hand, I imagine a lot of insurers' risk is concentrated in organizations that rely on this. And I'm just curious to get your perspective. It seems like this kind of authentication platform can really cut both ways.
Well, like a lot of technology, it's both about how you implement it and the processes and the people behind the technology, right? So it's a trifecta: people, processes, technology. And if you don't have a process to manage who can push out broad changes within the network, like wiping a device, maybe have a dual authentication within people, you don't have just-in-time access, then you're not necessarily, as far as a governance structure within a very powerful tool, you're not governing it in a way that an insurer might expect you to use this. So centralized identity management can be a very great thing for an organization, particularly for an organization that is as large as Stryker. But what really matters is how you're managing it, and are you building security into the tools that you're using, into the convenience of something that's centralized. Security by design is like, it's almost like a slogan on a wall, but it really matters. It should be a mantra, could be a tattoo that someone wears. And I would like to see it embedded in the way that companies do everything. And that goes down to things that are very powerful. They should also, like in kind, have very powerful controls around it. And I know that makes it slightly less convenient to have these sort of controls in place, but it makes it far more secure. And this type of attack is the use case for putting these sort of controls in place.
That makes sense. Well, and I know Microsoft and CISA both recommended multi-admin approval. I imagine if you're pushing out an update to 200,000 devices, maybe get a second person to log in and hit approve before that actually gets pushed out. And sure, it can slow things down a little bit, but it's just like getting money from a bank vault. It's part of the maturity of those processes. Is that the kind of question? Are we going to start seeing that on insurance applications? We've had requirements for penetration testing for years. What I haven't seen are requirements for, hey, are we going to do a configuration review of our 365 tenant or Intune or Entra? Like, are we going to start to see insurers paying more attention to how our cloud tools are configured?
I would say in broad strokes. I think they're going to ask broadly more governance questions. What you're going to find is right now in the market, there's been a lot of pushback to the highly detailed questions. And the reason for that is I'm a CISO. I'm filling out 1 million of these. It's a pain in the backside, right? It's an annoyance, but it's an absolute requirement in order to get insurance. So what the insurers are trying to do is balance the economy of filling out a 500-page application versus getting enough information to understand how this environment is being governed. So there are other questions, generally speaking, that you can ask to understand if this organization has security by design. You don't have to ask the specific question, but I think on all applications, particularly for larger organizations, you're going to see identity management questions really unpacked. And will they be asked in a way that quite fits the way that the organization who's applying for insurance manages it? No. And what I recommend to those organizations is respond how you think you should respond. And then there's always a part at the end where you can explain. The insurers understand more than you think. They have technical people on their staff to help them decipher what you're doing in your environment because, as you know, Sherri, environments are almost like the human body. There's not one environment that mimics another one. Everyone does it differently. There's little quirks within all environments, and you really have to have a deep technical understanding to parse the good from the bad. So all the major carriers have technical people on staff to help look at these applications. My advice to those who are applying is take the measure of pain in filling it out.
That makes sense. You know, it seems like so much of the risk is really in the nuances, like the details. And I'd love to get your insight as to how much the insurer can even really infer from the high level questions that we see in the application. And a good example might be backups. You know, a company like Stryker might have backups, but what if those backups are destroyed by the attacker? What if they're available, like they're there, but they can't get access to them? I think that happens a lot as well, and that delays the restoration phase. Are we really getting a clear picture of risk just from the high-level application?
Not all applications, but I will tell you, insurers they focus in on a couple of key points. We talked about MFA. They really do ask a lot of questions there. Backups are another place where they ask a lot of questions because from a resilience standpoint, insurers believe in many ways some attacks are inevitable. Like an advanced persistent threat, sometimes there's nothing you could have done, right? And you're insuring to that fact. But what does the organization do to limit the blast radius? So limit the negative effects of the attack. One of the very proven claim studies is tested, immutable offline backups that the company has enough internet availability to upload back. Another thing that insurers are asking more about, interestingly enough, is Active Directory, right? How long is your recovery time for Active Directory? Because in a ransomware attack, which is different but not so dissimilar to the way that the Stryker attack occurred, Active Directory is often targeted and often needs to be rebuilt, which can be a very slow, painful process and cause a lot of downtime. So we're seeing more questions on that, but recovery and resilience, business continuity is a very large piece of how an insurer will evaluate the worthiness and the appropriateness of this risk and how good organizations cyber posture is. So invest in backups. It matters for your organization, and it will positively impact your insurance.
Excellent advice, I think, for everybody. So, turning our attention to the hackers that attacked Stryker, an Iranian hacktivist group has claimed that it was that they perpetrated the attack. And what does that mean for insurance coverage? Obviously, Stryker was not covered, but I think a lot of other organizations are paying attention and saying, in times of war, is this something that I would still be covered for? Is it going to be excluded?
So that's an excellent question. Most cyber policies have what's called a war exclusion. What do I mean by that? It means that if thousands and thousands of companies were attacked in a cyber event all at once, sponsored or a nation state like Iran, then the cyber industry would be wiped out. So this is a mechanism for cyber insurers to protect themselves from financial devastation. And quite frankly, it's not just the insurers, which in many ways are the backbone of the American economy. If there was an attack that thousands and thousands of companies were impacted, we'd be in a lot of trouble. It would almost be
Right.
one of the least of our concerns. So there is a war exclusion. And like most things in cyber insurance, there is a lot of variation on how that they apply, right? These sort of war exclusions exist across the insurance industry. So your property insurance will have a war exclusion, and those war exclusions were tested. And what the courts found out was they really don't apply well to cyber events where there is no real kinetic impact, right? But many
Right.
companies across the world were affected by an attack backed by the Russian government and on the country of Ukraine. And then there was a downstream effect on commercial entities all around the world, and to the tune of $3 billion in losses.
I assume you're talking about not Petcha?
Not Petcha, yeah.
Absolutely.
So what happened from there is the Lloyd's Market Association, which gives guidelines for how the Lloyd's market will handle these sort of situations, put out guidelines that's carved out events that are backed, state-backed, which can cause some problems, right? Because what does
Well,
state... Go ahead.
yeah, as a forensic investigator, I always used to think if I do a good job and I figure out that this was related to, nation state actors from China or Russia, then my client might not be covered. Is that the case? Or how can you confirm attribution?
When we're talking about an exclusion on an insurance policy, it's not you as the insured who has to prove that it was, attributed to a nation state. It's actually the insurer's responsibility if they were going to say, hey, no coverage, this is cyber warfare. So they have the burden to gather the evidence, make that attribution call, which, Sherri, attribution is based on levels of confidence, and it's very rarely high level of confidence on very firm evidence that you say, yes, this attribution is clear and this exclusion will apply. And if you think about it, even if, for example, let's just say another nation says, yes, we know this attack was backed by nation state X, that could be politically motivated. So the
Right.
world of geopolitics is very complicated.
And sometimes hacktivist groups claim it was them when it wasn't. And what does it even mean to be part of a hacktivist group? Who knows?
Right. So there would have to be a substantial amount of evidence to show that this was indeed the hacktivist group, not just a social media post claiming it was them, and that indeed that hacktivist group was at the direction, funded by, or actually the state of Iran, which would be very difficult to show. And quite frankly, what we know about geopolitics, were I a country who wanted to cause fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the United States, why wouldn't I send one of my attackers? Or if I were just a bored teenager, would I do this too? And so it really could be anybody. There is strong case law around the application and the construction of an insurance policy, what evidence is needed. And the other thing too, I would take into consideration, the cyber insurance industry has been dealing with attribution issues for a while. They've had attackers who they had to decipher whether they were either on an OFAC list or connected to someone who has been sanctioned by the United States government.
Or
So
ransom payments.
for ransom payments, it's a regular analysis that these claims teams do. And by and large, it comes out in favor of the insured. So I would have a good amount of skepticism and look at your policy, make sure your war exclusion is clear to you and the construction of it makes sense. This is a great conversation to have with your broker, but also have some faith in the industry in that they have competent individuals who know how to decipher the evidence. There's a high burden of evidence in order to use this exclusion. And the world of geopolitics is complicated.
And
And
the insurer has the burden of proof.
correct.
Great to know. Why don't we come back to what we were talking about at the beginning? Stryker did not have cyber insurance. And you mentioned that that may also have been the case with Jaguar Land Rover. I was very surprised that that was actually a statement on their website. So I'm curious to know, number one, is this normal for them to put on their website that they are self-insured? And also, it seems to be a trend with these very large companies. I'm curious to get your perspective on why that might be and if you feel that might be shifting. Or maybe it's that the insurers themselves don't want that risk and are pricing it too high.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We've sort of studied that internally from the broker side. There are plenty of Fortune 500 companies who insure cyber risk. But there's also a prevailing thought that insurance is expensive. I'd rather take that money that we're putting into insurance and put it back into my cyber posture because we are a very large company. We have a very large balance sheet and we can absorb the risk. So really, it's an executive and board decision on where they want to put the risk. But what they lose from not going to the insurance market, they don't get the second, third, fourth set of eyes on their security posture and questioning decisions they made, or backing, saying, hey, you've got a great posture. We really want to back you. And third, insurers are on your side. They do not want you to have an attack. So they provide a lot of value add. And one of the value add services, for example, that many insurers subscribe in is they put all of their insureds with one of these threat intelligence companies. And this threat intelligence company, for example, will see if any of their access is being sold on the access market. And they will intervene and buy up that access. Now, that's not something every company, one, can afford, or two, even knows how to provide. But, from what we know about this attack, access was bought, access was used, and perhaps could this attack been avoided? We'll never know. But that's something...
That's right. So you're saying the credentials for an admin account were sold on the dark web.
Correct.
And I think that gets to the point where sometimes we're not targets of opportunity, or just sometimes there are these hybrid attacks where someone happens to click on a link in a phishing email, happens to lose their credentials, and then an attacker looks and says, that would be a target of interest for me. So it's almost like, okay, someone happened to lose those account credentials and another person bought them and then used that because it's part of that whole dark web economy.
It's part of the threat actor economy. This is how threat actors make money. It's a distributed network, much like mafia. It's organized crime. There's different players within organized crime. Everybody makes money along the way. Global corporations are just as susceptible to these sort of risks as small mom and pop shops. One of the benefits of insurance is it's another financial backing to your posture. And they are in the risk with you. So they will do everything they can do within their power to bolster your posture, whether it's give you advice, whether it's recommend that you make changes, whether it's subscribe to this threat intelligence company that offers this service.
Right. And in the event that an incident occurs, I've seen insurers just provide that invaluable service of banding victims together, especially when there's a widespread event, and advocating on behalf of all of them, which I feel like has really changed the game. Let's talk a little bit about what is going to happen next in the Stryker case, because in addition to being down, the criminals are claiming that they've exfiltrated up to 50 terabytes of data. So speaking of the dark web and the criminal economy, what do you think is the risk that we might see the criminals start to leak that? And we certainly, according to reports, we haven't seen a ransom demand yet. But do you think there's a risk that they might try to productize some of this?
Depends on the quality of the information that they got and the availability and the funding of the threat actor. A lot of times with the ransomware economy, they can't really make that much money off of it. It would take a lot of bandwidth to do something with it, so it just isn't fiscally reasonable to monetize a lot of that information. It's better just to threaten to leak it, and extort money. We'll see. Can't really make any predictions because I am very bad at predicting what a bad guy will do. But my guess is as good as anything. I think if there was very sensitive information in there, it may be leaked. If there was damaging information to, if it was an Iranian, attacker, you could imagine if there was damaging information to Israel, United States, that would be leaked to the extent that a medical company would have that kind of information.
Do you think in order to hack a company this big, it has to be done by a nation state actor? Because I've seen some of that hypothesis out there in the news that I'm curious to get your perspective.
No, I mean, listen, I think attacks where, for example, Active Directory is taken over happen every single day in companies big, small, medium. I couldn't tell you that underwriters are asking about phishing resistant MFA if it wasn't happening all over the place. I think of things like the MGM resort attack. Very
Yes.
similar. Very similar.
Teenagers. Teenagers
right.
were involved.
Right. This was a sophisticated attack? No. Do I think it had a huge impact on the company? Yes. But just like a ransomware attack might. When I think of a sophisticated attack, think of SolarWinds.
Yes.
I find that was a challenging supply chain attack that took
Planting
a lot of
malware into a supply chain, stealing the signing certificate so it would bypass intrusion detection. That was amazing. It's kind of hilarious to me every time I see it was a sophisticated cyber attack, and then you're like, oh, that was a phishing attack.
right. Well, what they mean is not that the tactics used were unknown and sophisticated. It's that the impact was so widespread. And that doesn't mean sophistication, it just means devastation. It means that they didn't have enough segmentation controls, security, and one of these types of attacks could have taken place, which, quite frankly, with the amount of money that large companies tend to invest in cybersecurity, it's surprising to people. And so they conflate investment in cybersecurity and an attack with sophistication, when this was very basic.
Well, and we are starting to see attackers using techniques that demonstrate they're familiar with enterprise IT administration tools. That does not mean they are nation state actors, but they have the skill set of a mid-sized to large network administrator. In this case, familiarity with Microsoft Entra, familiarity with Intune, the mobile device management system. So adversaries are starting to recruit people and train people to use admin tools, and they're using those tools against us.
Yeah, and I will say, living off the land techniques, which is what this was, right? You're using the company's own tools against them, have been happening for the last 10 years in both very sophisticated attacks and very basic attacks. With the proliferation of AI and the amount of information people can get at the few keystrokes on a keyboard, you can figure out how to do a lot of things in an environment with very little sophistication, unfortunately.
It's so true, and the attackers are using it against us. Well, Bridget, thanks so much for joining us. Did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to share on Stryker before we wrap up?
I think to sum it up, cyber insurance is important. It really does give not just a risk transfer, but it gives people an understanding where they are with their peers, and it gives other sets of eyes to your security posture. I will say, I think we agree that this wasn't a sophisticated attack, so do the basics really well and build security into the way you do everything, even if it's inconvenient, because it matters in attacks like this. Layers of defense or layers of annoyance, and it limits blast radius, and it prevents attackers to getting to the core controls.
Well said, Bridget. Thank you so much for your insight from the cyber insurance world. I really appreciate you joining us today. And thanks so much to everybody tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Cyberside Chats.